true tale to cheer you, from Roosevelt's era, of a fellow who never stood still. A gambler, a talker, above all a walker, a pedestrian, if you will. But a pedestrian king, if there is such a thing, for at walking he had no peer. He won long-distance races in all kinds of places, a steam engine on legs, so I hear. A walking race? That's a rather dull thing for us with so much distraction. But the 19th century had no TikTok or tweets. Edward Weston was the attraction. People would come from cities and towns to marvel at young Weston. Walk 6 days straight, night and day, round a track, doing 500 miles before resting. Turned out like a dandy in bow tie and ruffles, or a velvet suit, bowler and sash, Weston was always the star of the show, winning races while cutting a dash. And no one before him had made walking their business, and perhaps no one has since his time. He sold postcards, pamphlets, timetables and tickets to shows where he'd march and opine. They gave him a name that cemented his fame, understated perhaps, but it stuck all the same. Weston the Pedestrian, they called him back then, and his feats inspired me to pick up my pen. Being freshly retired and decently fit, I like to pretend that I still have that it. I go on my runs and I climb all those hills and attend to my miles much more than my bills. But when my legs are hurting and I feel a bit racked, I rally myself with one blessed fact. Weston's great walk came not in his prime, but when he was 70 in 1909. Picture this. Edward Weston, dapper as ever, surveyed the growing throng. They'd come to see him one last time, that crowd 10,000 strong. They'd come to New York's old post office to wish him on his way. He'd bet he could walk to San Francisco in only 100 days. The savvy old gent knew the appeal of the 100-day claim he was staking. Newspapers lined up for exclusive dispatches of the progress each week he'd be making. And gamblers too were paying attention. The brave ones bet he'd win out, but most of them doubted the 100-day claim, and the odds reflected that doubt. It was a bit after 4 on a late winter's day when Weston started his walk. He made Yonkers by 9 and dined with the mayor, then fronted a crowd who demanded a talk. He lectured on diet, a firm bed at night, the French marching style, and muscles too tight. He regaled them with stories of feats by the score, then bade them adieu and walked out the door. He trudged until 1 in the morning that night, frost on the turnpike reflecting moonlight. 30 miles due north he'd made on day 1, but west across the land he'd not even begun. Now it's 3,000 miles across this big land if you walk on a line mostly taut. But Weston's route needed 4,000 miles through towns that would pay for his thoughts. So 40 miles a day was required, and a speech most night for his pains. North for 6 days to Albany, then west for his run to the plains. Across upstate New York, the crowds lined the streets. They'd known him from earlier fame. Some 40 years back, he'd made $10,000 walking fast to Chicago from Maine. Through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana he barreled, into blizzards that were not in the plan. His crew in a newfangled automobile that broke down more than it ran. Walking by day and speaking by night, he managed to pick up the pace. He was met in Chicago by 10,000 fans 5 weeks after starting the race. Ahead of his schedule, 1,200 miles in, the roads seemed less muddy and the weather less grim. He loudly proclaimed that he would win the prize. Ahead were the prairies, flat roads and May skies. Now fortune's a river that rarely runs straight, and old men should know it's not wise to tempt fate. Nearly 3,000 miles remained in his trip, a chasm unseen twixt the cup and the lip. He relaxed for a day, bulking up with a feast, penning glowing updates to the papers back east, repeating his boast that he'd finish in leisure. The man was naive of Midwestern spring weather. Moving out of Chicago, the rain fell in sheets, the cornfields were flooded and the roads ran knee-deep. The car bogged so badly that it sat for 2 days, and his walking slowed down to a funeral parade. He lost all his cushion in one dreadful week. A change was required, or the outlook was bleak. County roads were his bane with their floods monumental. But the railways were raised and transcontinental. If you've walked on a rail bed, you'll know what it's like. Your legs never settle on a stride that feels right. The gravel's too soft and the ties make you pay, and trains seem to think that they have right of way. It wasn't too bad on the wide open plains. He walked on the rail bed, his crew rode the trains. They travelled in comfort from station to station, securing his lodgings and crowds for the oration. Progress was steady and sure, if not fast, but in western Missouri he hit an impasse. The great river Missouri was spanned at that spot by a narrow rail bridge with no place to pull off. More than a mile long and 100 feet high, the odds were not good should a train rumble by. There were no other crossings for miles south or north. He needed a schedule before he set forth. A cheerful young local was keen to help out. After the next one, there's 15 minutes about. About, cried Weston, he needed precision. But gone was the kid. Weston faced his decision. Through the gaps between the ties, he could see only air, and the muddy brown river returning his stare. He paused for a moment, straining to hear any sound of a train, and then swung into gear. Weston's river of fortune flowed smooth on that morn. He reached the far shore ere the sound of a horn, but the memory lodged in his dreams for a spell, a train or a river to sweep him to hell. Across western Missouri and then into Kansas he marched with unflagging stride. The headwinds were strong and the towns far apart. Long gone were the crowds by his side. Some days were scorching and some nearly freezing, always the wind in his face. Some days fair skies, but some days tornadoes that hunkered him down in one place. But by the last week of May, he landed upon the bustling burg of Denver, the greatest city of those wide open plains that welcomed him in splendor. And the Denver Post had organized grand fireworks for his arrival. Perched on a balcony above the crowds, he made light of his survival. But just as his talk was winding up, he brought it to an end. Forgive me, friends, I must attend to my progress for today. There's 20 more miles before I'm done, though it pains me not to stay. It was not just the calendar that pushed him along, though that hurry was hard to deny. What he saw when he looked to the west chilled his blood, those mountains that reached to the sky. Yes, the steepest peaks of the ragged Rockies now blocked him to the west. So north to Wyoming, 100 miles, just to find a crossable crest. Towns had been sparse in Colorado, but Wyoming set him aghast. One day he had to walk 36 miles before he could break his fast. But then he hit, near Rawlin, Wyoming, the Continental Divide. It's downhill from here, he said to himself, and a bounce returned to his stride. Well, water wends its way downhill, but a man isn't river or rain. 1,000 miles were still to go. Only 20 short days yet remained. Maintaining that mileage through these harsh lands filled him with dread and dismay. From here, every day would mean 50 miles. A cruel price his old body must pay. 200 miles later, a temporary reprieve, for like the Mormons before him, he found Utah, an Eden of grasses and streams that welcomed the weary pilgrim. Now Brigham Young and his Mormon train by the Great Salt Lake came to rest. But Weston just cursed this inland sea that now blocked his path to the west. Abroad on the streets of orderly Ogden, he again sought local advice. Which way should he go round this big briny sea? Either way might add days to his plight. At last he located a knowledgeable local with a grin and a voice that did falter. If going around it's too far for your liking, you could always just walk on the water. A snort in retort was all he could muster, but indeed no detour was needed. A 12-mile rail trestle crossed the water with ease for 2 trains to go by unimpeded. The day he left Ogden and trod on that trestle was a day he'd not quickly forget. He made 72 miles before he retired. Perhaps he would triumph yet. And the railway company had made him an offer that filled him with bravado. They'd provide a man and a velocipede to help through the worst of Nevada. In case you're wondering, a velocipede was a gas-powered rig designed for checking the track, but this one carried food, water and ice, a movable feast at his back. Now the worst of Nevada was a fearsome place. Sandstorms that pummeled him raw, days so hot he walked only at night, and the darkness then slowing him more. Through basins and ranges no respite was found, and the miles came ever too few. The closer he got to the snowy Sierra, the greater his deficit grew. As far as we know, Weston kept no journal, and his dispatches were ever upbeat. So we'll have to imagine the pain he felt when the math finally signaled defeat. The truth seemed to hit in Lovelock, Nevada, just 300 miles from his goal. He would not set foot on the Golden Gate on the day he'd so often foretold. A lesser man might have stopped right there. Not Weston, as ever unbowed. The old man gave word that he'd finish his walk at a pace that conditions allow. Up through the Sierras, down past Sacramento, the conditions allowed a fair pace. Released from the clock and done with the rails, a smile returned to his face. And crowds, growing crowds around him each day. They knew they'd not see this again. That someone so old had done something so bold was almost too much to explain. And somehow his fate of just missing his date made it all the more poignant and true, for the lines in his face and the strain in his gait gave a sense of the hell he'd been through. On day 104, from Oakland's Long Pier, he crossed Frisco Bay in a boat. Precise to the end, he'd walked 3 extra miles to make up for the distance afloat. Standing erect at the bow of the ship, like Washington crossing the Delaware, they saw him coming from Telegraph Hill and fireworks burst in midair. They wanted to carry him on their shoulders to his hotel a mile from the pier. But the dapper old gent politely demurred, "I think I can make it from here." The news went out across the wide land. The president sent his compliment. Calendar be damned, not quite as planned, but Weston had walked the continent. That should have been that. That should have been that. The beloved old chap should have been justly contented. Others before him had claimed such a walk, but never so well documented. And the papers moved on, for while he'd been gone, Robert Peary had reached the North Pole. An age of exploration was opening up that made Weston's brave march seem a stroll. But to one old man, there remained the matter of the 100 days not met. That his final walk should fall just short consumed him with regret. Of course, stories like mine, long-winded and rhymed, delight in great heroes who fail. Who now would know of the Mudville 9 had Casey somehow prevailed? But a life fully lived is more than a ballad. And who says when the story must end? A man or a woman can grasp their own fate. True lives contain twists that transcend. Back in New York, he carefully reviewed just where the time had gone. The harsh high plains, the long detours, and always the headwinds strong. And quietly, the very next spring, he rode the railways west, walking eastbound from Los Angeles. He moved like a man possessed. I'll spare you the shorter route he took, but the wind was at his back, the weather held, and the miles flew by. He was on the inside track. Soon enough, the press took note, reporting a preposterous boast. I'll wrap this up before summer hits. 90 days at most. Tempting the fates by listing his dates, he then published a day-by-day plan. After so much boasting throughout his career, few now believed the old man. But this time, somehow, his word was good. He crushed his 90-day plan, met back in New York on day 79 by 250,000 fans. Weston lived another 20 years, drawing crowds into his 80s, walking through towns and doffing his caps to the gentlemen and ladies. Yes, Weston's age was another time. We think we're so busy today. We drive in our cars and tap on our phones and fritter our time away. But I like to think the pedestrian might be tramping out there still, showing you can do damn near anything with enough vision, pluck, and will. Thank you.